Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I was 19 when our family decided to adopt a dog from the local animal shelter. It was the spring of 2019, and I had just finished my first year of community college, feeling restless and uncertain about my future. The dog we brought home was a golden retriever mix named Penny, though her coat was more cream-colored than truly golden. She had these expressive brown eyes that seemed to understand everything you said to her, and an energy level that could exhaust a marathon runner. Our house sat on the outskirts of Millfield, a town so small it barely qualified for a dot on most maps. With a population hovering around 800 people, everyone knew everyone else's business, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. The nearest city was over an hour's drive away, which meant entertainment options were limited to what nature could provide. Fortunately, our property backed up to thousands of acres of state forest land, creating an endless playground for a restless college student and an energetic dog. Those first few weeks with Penny were a revelation. She had this insatiable need to explore, to sniff every tree trunk, investigate every rustling bush, and chase every squirrel that dared cross her path. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to our daily walks more than I had anticipated. What started as simple 30-minute strolls around our neighborhood quickly evolved into hour-long expeditions into the surrounding woodlands. The forest behind our house was a mixture of hardwood and pine, with well-worn deer trails crisscrossing through the undergrowth. During those early explorations, I stuck to the obvious paths, the ones that showed clear signs of regular use by both animals and the occasional human visitor. Penny would trot ahead of me, her tail wagging constantly, occasionally doubling back to make sure I was keeping up with her pace. My parents were supportive of these hiking adventures, especially my mother, who worried that I spent too much time indoors playing video games and browsing social media. Fresh air and exercise, she would say, that's what you both need. She wasn't wrong. Those walks became a daily ritual that I genuinely craved, a break from the suffocating routine of small-town life and the pressure of figuring out what to do with my future. As weeks turned into months, I began to notice changes in both Penny and myself. She became more confident in the woods, her initial cautious exploration giving way to bold investigation of every interesting scent or sound. I, meanwhile, found myself becoming more attuned to the forest's rhythms, learning to identify different bird calls, recognizing the signs of various animals that called these woods home, and developing an almost instinctive sense of direction among the trees. The regular trails we followed were pleasant enough, winding through stands of oak and maple, crossing small creeks via fallen logs or makeshift bridges, and occasionally opening up into small clearings where wildflowers bloomed in season. But after months of following the same routes, I began to feel a familiar restlessness creeping in. The trails that had once seemed like gateways to adventure now felt routine, predictable, even boring. Penny seemed to sense my growing dissatisfaction with our usual routes. She would pause at familiar trail junctions, looking back at me with what I swear was disappointment. When I chose the same path we had walked dozens of times before, it was as if she was asking, "Aren't we going to try something new today?" Her silent reproach finally convinced me that it was time to venture beyond our comfortable boundaries. The decision to leave the established trails wasn't made lightly. I had grown up hearing stories about people who got lost in these woods, sometimes for days, before search and rescue teams could locate them. The forest was vast, with thousands of acres stretching in every direction, and it was easy to become disoriented among trees that all looked remarkably similar. But I was confident in my growing familiarity with the area, and I always carried a compass and my cell phone, though service was spotty at best in the deeper parts of the forest. Our first off-trail adventure was modest, a short detour from one of our regular paths to investigate what looked like an old logging road. The road had been reclaimed by nature years ago, but the route was still visible as a slight depression in the forest floor, marked by trees that were noticeably younger than their surroundings. Penny loved this new territory, her excitement obvious as she bounded ahead, nose to the ground, following scent trails that were invisible to me. That first successful deviation from our routine opened up a world of possibilities. Over the following weeks, we began exploring old logging roads, abandoned trails, and game paths that led deeper into the forest than I had ever ventured. We discovered hidden clearings where deer had bedded down, leaving circular impressions in the tall grass. We found streams that weren't marked on any map I had seen. Crystal clear water flowing over smooth stones and creating tiny waterfalls that sparkled in the filtered sunlight. Each new discovery fueled my growing obsession with exploration. I started researching the history of our local forest, learning about the logging operations that had once dominated the area, the old homesteads that had been abandoned when the timber played out, and the network of roads and trails that had connected these remote settlements to the outside world. Much of this infrastructure still existed, hidden beneath decades of new growth but still navigable for those willing to push through the undergrowth. Penny thrived on these adventures, her confidence growing with each successful expedition. She developed an uncanny ability to navigate through the forest, often leading me along paths that I wouldn't have noticed on my own. Sometimes I wondered if she could sense things that were beyond my perception, the way she would suddenly change direction or pause to examine something that looked perfectly ordinary to me. As summer progressed, our hiking adventures became longer and more ambitious. We would set out early in the morning, when the air was still cool and the forest was alive with birdsong, and wouldn't return home until late afternoon, both of us tired but satisfied with our discoveries. I began carrying a small backpack with water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit, treating these expeditions with the seriousness they deserved. The forest was revealing its secrets to us, one hidden trail at a time. We found abandoned deer stands, their wooden platforms weathered and overgrown with vines. We discovered old stone foundations, probably the remains of cabins or outbuildings from the area's logging days. In one memorable expedition, we stumbled across what appeared to be an old cemetery, its handful of weathered headstones barely visible among the encroaching vegetation. But it was during one of our longer explorations on a humid day in late August that we made the discovery that would change everything. The morning of August 28, 2019, started like many others that summer. I woke before dawn, eager to beat the heat that had been building steadily over the past week. The weather forecast called for temperatures in the low 90s, with humidity levels that would make the air feel thick and oppressive by midday. If we were going to have a successful hiking adventure, we needed to get an early start. Penny was already awake when I padded into the kitchen, her internal clock apparently synchronized with my hiking schedule. She watched me prepare our usual supplies: 2 bottles of water, a handful of granola bars, some jerky for protein, and a small bag of treats for her. I had learned from experience that these longer expeditions required more preparation than our early neighborhood walks. By 6:30, we were heading out the back door and into the forest. The air was still relatively cool, carrying the scent of pine needles and morning dew. Birds were active in the canopy above us, their calls echoing through the trees as they went about their early morning routines. Penny trotted ahead of me with her usual enthusiasm, occasionally pausing to investigate an interesting scent before hurrying to catch up. Our destination that morning was a section of the forest we had spotted from a ridge during our previous expedition, but hadn't yet explored. It lay beyond a series of low hills, in what appeared to be a natural depression that held a different type of vegetation than the surrounding areas. From our distant vantage point, it had looked like a mixture of hardwood and evergreen trees, with what might have been water reflecting light somewhere in the center. The hike to reach this unexplored area took us through familiar territory for the first hour, following one of our established off-trail routes through a series of old logging cuts. The forest floor here was relatively open, with most of the undergrowth cleared years ago when the trees were harvested. Young pines had grown up in the spaces between the older hardwoods, creating a mixed canopy that filtered the morning light into a soft, green-tinted glow. As we crested the first of the low hills, the character of the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thicker and older than what we had been walking through. The undergrowth became denser, forcing us to push through tangles of berry bushes and young saplings. Penny had to work harder to find clear paths, sometimes disappearing into the vegetation before emerging several yards ahead of me. The second hill was steeper and more challenging, its slope covered with loose rocks and fallen logs that made footing treacherous. I found myself grabbing onto tree trunks for support, my hiking boots slipping on the damp leaves that carpeted the forest floor. Penny, with her four-legged advantage, managed the climb much more easily, though I noticed she was panting more heavily than usual despite the relatively cool morning air. From the top of the second hill, we could see our destination more clearly. The depression in the forest floor was larger than it had appeared from a distance, probably covering several acres. The vegetation was indeed different here, with more evergreen trees and what looked like areas of wetland scattered throughout. Most intriguingly, there were several open spaces that might have been clearings or possibly bodies of water, though the distance and the angle made it difficult to tell for certain. The descent into this hidden valley was steep and required careful navigation. The soil was different here, darker and more organic, as if water regularly collected in this area during heavy rains. The trees were older too, some of them massive specimens that must have escaped the logging operations that had claimed most of their brethren. Their canopy was so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a twilight atmosphere, even though it was still mid-morning. Penny's behavior began to change as we descended into the valley. Her usual eager exploration became more cautious, more deliberate. She would pause frequently, raising her nose to test the air, her ears rotating to catch sounds that were beyond my hearing. Several times she looked back at me with what I interpreted as uncertainty, as if she was asking whether we should continue. The air in the valley felt different. It was cooler, which was welcome given the rising temperature, but it also felt heavier, more humid. There was a smell too, not unpleasant exactly, but earthy and organic in a way that reminded me of compost or rotting vegetation. The sounds were different as well. The bird calls that had been constant throughout our hike grew sporadic, and there was an underlying silence that felt unnatural in a forest that should have been teeming with life. As we pushed deeper into the valley, we encountered our first area of wetland. It wasn't quite a swamp, but the ground was soft and spongy underfoot, with standing water visible in the low spots. Cattails and other wetland plants grew in thick clusters, and I could hear the sound of water moving somewhere ahead of us, though I couldn't see its source. Penny picked her way carefully through this area, her paws making soft squelching sounds in the muddy ground. The evergreen trees became more dominant as we continued, their needle-covered branches creating an almost tunnel-like effect over what appeared to be an old trail. The path was barely visible, more of a game trail than anything humans had created, but it seemed to lead in the direction we wanted to go. The pine needles underfoot muffled our steps, making our passage almost silent except for the occasional crack of a dead branch or the rustle of vegetation as we pushed through denser areas. After nearly an hour of careful navigation through this changing landscape, we finally reached what appeared to be the center of the valley. The trees opened up slightly, revealing a roughly circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across. The ground here was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles and decomposing leaves, creating a soft surface that felt almost spongy underfoot. But what immediately caught my attention wasn't the clearing itself, but what lay at its far edge. There, nestled between the massive trunks of several ancient pine trees, was a body of water unlike anything I had seen in our months of forest exploration. It wasn't the kind of clear, babbling creek or small pond that we had encountered elsewhere. This was something altogether different, something that made me stop in my tracks and stare. The water was perfectly dark, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was absolutely still, without even the slightest ripple to disturb its mirror-like appearance. It was roughly oval in shape, perhaps 60 or 70 feet at its widest point, and extended back into the shadows between the trees far enough that I couldn't see its far shore. But what really captured my attention, what made me stand there staring despite Penny's obvious discomfort, was the single dead tree that stood in the center of the dark water. It wasn't a fallen log or a piece of debris that had somehow ended up there. This was a tree that had apparently grown in that spot, died and remained standing even as the water level around it rose. Its pale, leafless branches reached up toward the canopy like gnarled fingers, creating a stark silhouette against the dark water. There was something almost hypnotic about the scene. The contrast between the perfectly still, dark water and the skeletal tree created an image that seemed more like something from a dream than a real place hidden in the forest. I found myself drawn toward the water's edge, my feet moving almost without conscious direction. It was then that I noticed Penny's reaction, and it was unlike anything I had seen from her during all our months of hiking together. Penny had stopped moving entirely, her body rigid with a tension I had never seen before. She stood about 10 feet behind me, her legs slightly spread as if bracing herself against some invisible force. Her ears were pinned back against her head, and her tail, usually wagging or at least relaxed, was tucked tightly between her legs. But most disturbing of all was the sound she was making. A low, continuous whine that seemed to come from deep in her throat, a sound of pure distress. I turned away from the dark pond to look at her more closely. "What's wrong, girl?" I asked, using the gentle tone that usually calmed her when she was anxious. But instead of responding to my voice, she took several steps backward, never taking her eyes off the water behind me. Her whining grew more intense, and I could see that her whole body was trembling. In all the months we had been hiking together, through encounters with wild animals, thunderstorms, and challenging terrain, I had never seen Penny react this way to anything. She was typically a brave, confident dog who approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. Even when we had stumbled across that old cemetery with its weathered headstones, she had investigated it with interest rather than anxiety. But this was different. Every instinct she possessed seemed to be telling her that we needed to leave this place immediately. I looked back at the pond, trying to see it through her senses to understand what had triggered such an extreme reaction. The dark water remained perfectly still, its surface like black glass reflecting the canopy above. The dead tree in its center stood exactly as it had when we first arrived, its bare branches reaching toward the sky. Nothing had changed, nothing had moved, and yet Penny's distress was escalating by the minute. "It's okay," I said, taking a step toward her. "It's just water, probably a natural spring or something." But even as I spoke the words, I felt uncertain about them. There was something about this place that didn't feel entirely natural, though I couldn't articulate what it was. Penny backed away further as I approached, her whining now mixed with short, sharp barks that echoed strangely in the clearing. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding trees and the dark water, creating an odd, muffled effect that made the barks sound distorted and unnatural. She was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate an urgency that went beyond her usual canine concerns. I knelt down and extended my hand toward her, using body language that usually reassured her when she was nervous. "Come here, Penny, it's all right." But she wouldn't come closer. Instead, she took several more steps backward, putting increasing distance between herself and both me and the pond. Her behavior was so unprecedented that I began to wonder if there might be a more practical explanation. Perhaps she could smell something I couldn't detect, some chemical contamination in the water that her more sensitive nose had picked up. Or maybe there was a dead animal somewhere nearby, decomposing in a way that created scents alarming to a dog, but undetectable to humans. I stood up and walked slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, staying well back from the water's edge but trying to get a better sense of the area. The pine needles and decomposing leaves underfoot were thick enough to muffle most sounds, but I could hear my own footsteps clearly enough. There were no obvious signs of dead animals, no overwhelming scents beyond the earthy, organic smell I had noticed when we first entered the valley. The trees surrounding the pond were ancient specimens, their trunks thick enough that it would take 3 or 4 people holding hands to encircle them. Their bark was deeply furrowed and covered with patches of moss and lichen. Some of them showed scars from old lightning strikes or storms, but they appeared healthy despite their age. There was nothing obviously threatening about the forest around us, but Penny's reaction continued to escalate. Her whining had become almost continuous now, punctuated by sharp barks that sounded increasingly desperate. She had backed up almost to the edge of the clearing, positioning herself near what appeared to be the clearest route back the way we had come. Her message was clear. She wanted to leave, and she wanted to leave now. I had learned to trust Penny's instincts during our months of hiking together. She had warned me about unstable footing on steep slopes, alerted me to the presence of wild animals before I had seen or heard them myself, and guided us away from areas that might have been dangerous for reasons I didn't understand. Her senses were far more acute than mine, and her survival instincts were undoubtedly better developed. But despite her obvious distress, I found myself reluctant to leave. There was something about this place that fascinated me, something that drew me back toward the dark water despite the rational part of my brain that said, I should listen to my dog's warnings. The pond was unlike anything I had seen before, and the opportunity to explore it might not come again. I compromised by moving closer to the water's edge while keeping one eye on Penny's reaction. The ground near the pond was soft and muddy, my boots sinking slightly with each step. The mud had an odd consistency, almost clay-like, and it made a soft sucking sound as I lifted my feet. The closer I got to the water, the more unstable the ground became, until I was standing on what felt like a thin crust over much softer material beneath. From this closer vantage point, I could see that the water was not completely opaque. There were depths visible beneath the dark surface, though they quickly faded to black just a few feet down. The dead tree in the center was more impressive up close, its trunk easily 3 feet in diameter and its branches spreading in complex patterns that created intricate shadows on the water's surface. But what struck me most was the absolute stillness of the water. Even with a slight breeze moving through the canopy above, the surface remained perfectly smooth. There were no insects skimming across it, no fish jumping, no signs of the life that should have been present in any natural body of water. It was as if the pond was somehow separate from the ecosystem around it, untouched by the normal cycles of forest life. Penny's barking became more frantic, and when I looked back at her, I saw that she had moved even further away from me. She was now at the very edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind one of the large pine trees. Her distress was so obvious that I felt guilty for not responding to her warnings immediately. "All right, girl," I called to her. "We'll go in a minute. Just let me take a quick look around." But as I spoke those words, something happened that changed everything. The perfectly still surface of the dark water was disturbed by a single, small ripple that spread outward from somewhere near the base of the dead tree. It was subtle, barely visible, but in water that had been absolutely motionless, it was as obvious as a scream. I froze, staring at the spot where the ripple had originated. There was no wind strong enough to create such a disturbance, no falling leaves or debris that could have broken the surface tension. The ripple had come from beneath the water, something moving in the depths that I couldn't see. As I watched, transfixed, another ripple appeared, this one slightly larger and originating from a different location, then another and another, until the surface of the pond was marked by a series of concentric circles that overlapped and interfered with each other in complex patterns. Penny's barking reached a pitch that was almost painful to hear, a sound of pure terror that cut through the forest air like a siren. She was no longer just warning me. She was pleading with me to move, to get away from whatever was creating those ripples in the dark water. But I couldn't move. I stood there ankle-deep in the muddy ground at the pond's edge, watching the disturbances in the water multiply and grow stronger. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Fish, though I had seen no signs of aquatic life. Bubbles from decomposing organic matter on the bottom, even small underground springs that might create currents in the water. But none of those explanations felt adequate as I watched the pattern of ripples become more complex, more organized, as if something large was moving purposefully beneath the surface. The dead tree in the center began to sway slightly, its branches creaking in a way that suggested the water around its base was being disturbed by something substantial. It was then, as I stood there mesmerized by the increasingly active water, that I noticed something that made my heart race. One of the larger ripples was moving in my direction, crossing the pond in a straight line that would bring it to the exact spot where I was standing. The ripple approaching me moved with a deliberate purpose that defied any natural explanation I could conjure. It wasn't the random disturbance of fish or the gentle spread of bubbles rising from decomposing matter. This was something large, something directed, something that seemed to have noticed my presence at the water's edge and was coming to investigate. I wanted to step back, every rational instinct screaming at me to retreat to safer ground, but my feet seemed rooted in the muddy soil. The approaching disturbance created a wake in the dark water, a V-shaped pattern that grew wider as it drew closer. Whatever was causing it had to be substantial, far larger than any fish that should have inhabited a forest pond. Penny's desperate barking had become a continuous sound of alarm, but it seemed to come from very far away despite her proximity. My attention was completely focused on the water, on the approaching ripple that was now only 20 feet from shore. The wake it created disturbed the reflection of the dead tree, breaking the skeletal branches into fragmented pieces that danced across the surface. 15 feet. 10 feet. The disturbance was slowing now, as if whatever created it was approaching more cautiously. The water just offshore from where I stood began to darken further. If such a thing was possible, what had been black as night seemed to deepen to an even more profound darkness, as if something large was rising from the depths. I found my voice and took a stumbling step backward, my boot making a loud sucking sound as I pulled it free from the mud. The noise seemed to echo across the water, and in response, the approaching disturbance stopped entirely. The pond returned to its mirror-like stillness so abruptly that I wondered if I had imagined the entire episode. But I hadn't imagined it. The evidence was still visible in the pattern of waves that lapped gently against the muddy shore, the only sound in a forest that had become unnaturally quiet. Even Penny had stopped barking, though when I glanced back at her, I could see that she remained rigid with terror, her eyes fixed on the water behind me. I took another step backward, then another, my eyes never leaving the surface of the pond. The stillness that had returned seemed different now, charged with potential energy as if the water was holding its breath. The dead tree in the center swayed slightly in a breeze that I couldn't feel, its branches creating soft creaking sounds that carried clearly across the water. It was as I was taking my fourth or fifth step backward that it happened. The thing I had been both dreading and anticipating, the moment that would haunt my dreams for months to come. Something broke the surface of the water. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no splash, no violent eruption from the depths. Instead, something pale simply appeared above the waterline so smoothly and quietly that it took several seconds for my brain to process what I was seeing. At first, it looked like a piece of driftwood or maybe a dead fish floating belly up. But as I stared, frozen in place, the shape became more defined, more recognizable, more terrifying. It was roughly oval, about the size of a dinner plate, and it was positioned near the base of the dead tree where the approaching ripple had originated. The color was wrong for anything that should have been in forest water. Instead of the browns and greens of natural organic matter, this was a pale, sickly white, like something that had been submerged for far too long. The surface appeared smooth but seemed to shimmer slightly, as if covered by a thin film of some kind. As I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of fascination and growing horror, the pale shape began to rotate slowly in the water. What had appeared to be a simple oval revealed itself to have more complex contours, ridges and depressions that caught the filtered light in unsettling ways. There were darker spots visible on the surface, arranged in a pattern that my mind struggled to interpret. It was Penny's renewed barking that finally broke the spell. Her voice cut through my trance like a physical blow, reminding me that I was standing in an increasingly dangerous situation. The pale thing in the water had stopped rotating and was now oriented directly toward me, as if it had somehow detected my presence and was studying me in return. I stumbled backward more quickly now, my rational mind finally overriding the horrible fascination that had kept me frozen at the water's edge. The ground became more stable as I moved away from the pond, my footing more secure on the thick carpet of pine needles that covered the clearing. But even as I retreated, I couldn't stop looking back at the water. The pale shape remained visible just below the surface, maintaining its orientation toward my position. As the distance between us increased, I could see that it was larger than I had initially thought, extending several feet in each direction. The darker spots on its surface were arranged in a pattern that looked almost like... I forced myself to stop that line of thinking. Whatever I was seeing, whatever had risen from the depths of that dark pond, I didn't want to examine it too closely. Some knowledge was too dangerous, some sights too disturbing to contemplate fully. Penny was already moving toward the edge of the clearing when I reached her position. She pressed against my legs for a moment, as if reassuring herself that I was still there, then immediately began leading the way back toward the trail we had followed into the valley. Her message was clear. We were leaving, and we were leaving now. I followed her gratefully, casting one final look back at the pond as we reached the tree line. The pale shape was still visible in the water, still oriented in our direction, but now there were others. 3 or 4 similar forms had appeared near the dead tree, all of them maintaining the same unsettling focus on our retreat. The hike back through the valley seemed to take forever. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in the peripheral vision made me spin around to check behind us. Penny led us unerringly back along the route we had taken, her usually enthusiastic exploration replaced by a focused determination to put distance between us and the dark pond. The climb out of the valley was harder than the descent had been, made more difficult by my frequent looks over my shoulder and the adrenaline that was making my hands shake. By the time we reached the ridge that overlooked the depression, both of us were breathing heavily, though from exertion or fear, I couldn't say. From our elevated position, I could see back down into the valley, though the thick canopy made it impossible to locate the pond among the trees. The entire area looked peaceful and ordinary from this distance, showing no signs of the disturbing discovery we had made. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I would never have believed that such a place existed in our familiar forest. The remainder of our hike home was completed in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Penny stayed closer to me than usual, occasionally looking back the way we had come as if checking to make sure we weren't being followed. Her behavior remained subdued even after we emerged from the forest and could see our house in the distance. It wasn't until we were safely inside, with the door locked behind us, that I began to process what we had experienced. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, trying to make sense of what I had seen in that dark pond. Penny lay at my feet, still showing signs of stress, her breathing more rapid than normal and her ears constantly moving as she monitored sounds from outside. The rational explanations I had considered while standing at the water's edge seemed inadequate now. Dead fish didn't orient themselves toward observers. Decomposing organic matter didn't rise to the surface in organized patterns, and nothing natural should have been able to create the sense of focused attention I had felt coming from those pale shapes in the water. But if natural explanations were insufficient, what did that leave? The alternative possibilities were even more disturbing, touching on things that rational people didn't believe in, things that belonged in horror movies rather than the real world. I spent the rest of that day trying to convince myself that I had imagined or misinterpreted what we had seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was in that pond, something that didn't belong in any forest ecosystem I had ever heard of. And worse still, whatever it was had been aware of our presence, had watched us, had perhaps even followed us to the water's edge. As night fell and I prepared for bed, I made a decision. We wouldn't be returning to that part of the forest. There were plenty of other areas to explore, other trails to follow. The dark pond and whatever inhabited it could remain undisturbed, a secret that Penny and I would keep to ourselves. But even as I made that resolution, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The memory of those pale shapes in the dark water, their unsettling focus and apparent intelligence, had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I would think about them when I was trying to fall asleep, wonder about them during quiet moments, and feel drawn back to that hidden valley, despite every rational instinct telling me to stay away. The dark pond had become an obsession, and obsessions, I was about to learn, have a way of drawing us back whether we want to go or not. That first night after our encounter at the pond, I barely managed to get any rest at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale shapes floating just beneath the dark surface, their unknown forms oriented toward me with what felt like malevolent attention. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with images of murky water and reaching branches, of things moving in the depths that I couldn't quite see clearly. I woke repeatedly throughout the night, sometimes from dreams so vivid they felt real, other times simply because my mind refused to quiet itself. During those wakeful hours, I found myself analyzing every detail of what we had experienced, trying to construct rational explanations for what we had seen. But each attempt at logical reasoning eventually collapsed under the weight of what I knew to be true. Penny seemed to be having similar difficulties. She paced restlessly through the house, occasionally whining softly as she stared out windows that faced the direction of the forest. When she finally settled down, it was on the floor next to my bed rather than in her usual spot in the living room. Even in sleep, she remained alert, her ears twitching at sounds that I couldn't detect. The next morning brought no relief from the obsessive thoughts that had plagued me through the night. Over breakfast, I found myself sketching the layout of the clearing, trying to capture the relative positions of the trees, the shape of the pond, and the location where those pale forms had appeared. The act of drawing helped me organize my memories, but it also made the experience feel more real, more undeniable. My parents noticed my distracted state, but attributed it to the usual concerns of a college student facing an uncertain future. When my mother asked about our hike the previous day, I gave a vague response about exploring new areas of the forest. I wasn't ready to share what we had discovered, partly because I wasn't sure they would believe me, and partly because talking about it would make it feel even more real. Over the following days, I tried to maintain our normal hiking routine, but both Penny and I seemed reluctant to venture far from familiar trails. We stuck to the well-known paths, the areas we had explored many times before, avoiding any routes that might lead us back toward that hidden valley. But even on these familiar walks, I found myself constantly scanning the forest, looking for signs of anything unusual or out of place. The obsession grew stronger rather than weaker as time passed. During quiet moments at home, I would find myself researching local history, looking for any mention of unusual bodies of water in our area. I searched online forums dedicated to local hiking and outdoor activities, hoping to find someone else who had discovered the same pond and could provide some explanation for what we had experienced. But my searches turned up nothing. There were no reports of dark ponds in our section of the forest, no mentions of unusual wildlife or strange phenomena. Either no one else had found the place we had discovered, or if they had, they weren't talking about it publicly. The latter possibility was almost as disturbing as the former. A week passed, then two, and still the memory of that dark water haunted my thoughts. I began to avoid hiking altogether, making excuses when Penny showed signs of wanting to go out for our usual adventures. She seemed to understand my reluctance and didn't push the issue, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. Our daily expeditions had been as important to her as they were to me, and my withdrawal from them was affecting her mood and energy level. It was during the third week after our encounter that I made a decision that I knew was probably unwise, but felt inevitable. I had to go back. The not knowing was worse than whatever we might face by returning to the pond. The constant speculation, the endless questions without answers, the way the memory had taken up residence in my mind like an unwelcome guest, it all had to end. I planned the return trip carefully, bringing more supplies than usual. Extra water, emergency food, a fully charged cell phone, though I doubted there would be service in that remote valley, and even a waterproof flashlight in case we ended up staying later than planned. I also brought a camera, an old digital model that my father had given me years earlier. If I was going to investigate this mystery properly, I needed documentation. Penny seemed to sense my intention before I announced it. As I gathered my hiking gear, she retreated to a corner of the living room and watched me with what I could only describe as resigned dread. She knew where we were going, and she clearly didn't want to make the journey, but she also understood that I was determined to go with or without her, and her loyalty wouldn't allow her to let me face whatever waited in that valley alone. The hike back to the hidden pond took longer than our first trip, partly because I was being more careful about marking our route, and partly because both Penny and I were moving more cautiously. As we descended into the valley, I could feel the same oppressive atmosphere that had been present during our first visit. The air was heavy and still, the sounds of forest life muted and subdued. When we finally reached the clearing, everything appeared exactly as we had left it. The dark water was mirror still. The dead tree stood sentinel in its center, and the thick carpet of pine needles showed no signs of disturbance since our last visit. But something felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arm stand up. Penny refused to enter the clearing, positioning herself at its edge where she had a clear escape route. I couldn't blame her for her caution, but I had come too far to turn back now. I approached the water's edge more slowly this time, my camera ready and my senses alert for any sign of movement beneath the surface. For several minutes, nothing happened. The pond remained still and dark, showing no trace of the disturbances we had witnessed during our first visit. I began to wonder if the entire experience had been some kind of hallucination, a shared moment of panic that had caused us both to imagine things that weren't really there. But then, just as I was beginning to doubt my own memories, something moved in the water near the dead tree. It was subtle at first, just a slight darkening in an area that was already nearly black. But as I watched through the camera's viewfinder, the disturbance grew more pronounced. The pale shape that emerged this time was different from what I remembered. It was larger, more clearly defined, and it broke the surface with a confidence that suggested it was no longer hiding from observation. As I watched, transfixed, it was joined by others, until there were at least half a dozen pale forms visible in the dark water. They were arranged in a rough circle around the base of the dead tree, and they were all oriented toward me. There was no question now about their awareness of my presence. Whatever these things were, they were watching me with the same intensity that I was watching them. I raised my camera and began taking pictures, the digital clicks sounding unnaturally loud in the silent clearing. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that weren't visible to my naked eye. The pale shapes had textures and contours that were disturbingly organic, surfaces that seemed to ripple and shift even as I watched. But it was when I lowered the camera to check the images I had captured that I received the shock that would send me running from that place once again. The camera's LCD screen showed the clearing, the dark water, and the dead tree in perfect detail, but the pale shapes that I could clearly see floating in the pond were completely absent from the photographs. According to my camera, the water was empty. I stared at the camera's display screen in disbelief, scrolling through the images I had just taken. Each photograph showed the same thing: a dark, still pond with a dead tree in its center, surrounded by ancient pines and a shadowy clearing. The composition was perfect, the lighting adequate, the focus sharp, but the pale shapes that were clearly visible to my eyes were nowhere to be found in the digital images. I looked up from the camera to confirm what I was seeing. The forms were still there, floating in their rough circle around the base of the dead tree, their surfaces catching what little light filtered through the canopy. They seemed more solid now, more present, as if my return to this place had somehow strengthened their ability to manifest. But when I looked back at the camera, they remained absent from every image. I tried adjusting the camera settings, switching from automatic to manual mode, changing the flash settings, even altering the white balance in case some unusual lighting condition was affecting the sensor. Nothing worked. No matter how I configured the camera, no matter what angle I shot from, the photographs showed only empty water where I could clearly see those pale, watching forms. The implications were deeply disturbing. Either there was something wrong with my perception, some kind of hallucination or optical illusion that was causing me to see things that weren't really there, or there was something present in the water that existed outside the normal spectrum of light that cameras could detect. Neither possibility was comforting. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of photographing the water directly, I began documenting everything else about the location. I took wide shots of the entire clearing, close-ups of the unusual vegetation, detailed images of the dead tree's branches and bark patterns. If I couldn't capture evidence of what was in the water, at least I could prove that this place existed. But even these seemingly straightforward photographs revealed anomalies. The dead tree, which appeared to be standing vertically in the center of the pond, showed up in the images as tilted at an impossible angle, as if it was leaning far to one side despite clearly standing upright to my eyes. The water level in the photographs appeared to be several feet lower than what I could observe directly, exposing muddy banks that weren't visible in reality. Most disturbing of all, when I photographed the clearing from different angles, the relative positions of the trees seemed to shift in ways that defied perspective. A large pine that appeared to be on my left in one image would show up on my right in the next, despite the fact that I had moved only a few steps between shots. Penny's distress was escalating again, her whining becoming more urgent as I continued my photographic documentation. She had backed away from the clearing entirely and was now positioned well into the tree line, ready to bolt at the first sign of real danger. Her behavior suggested that whatever was happening here was getting worse, not better. I tried taking pictures of Penny herself, hoping that at least those images would appear normal. But even photographs of my own dog came out strangely distorted. Her proportions seemed wrong, her features subtly altered in ways that made her look like a different animal altogether. In one particularly unsettling image, her eyes appeared to be reflecting light even though there was no flash, giving them an unnatural, almost luminous quality. The pale shapes in the water had begun to move more actively, creating gentle ripples that spread outward in complex patterns. But these disturbances, like the forms that created them, were invisible to the camera. The water appeared perfectly still in every photograph, even when I could clearly see its surface being disturbed by the movement of the watching entities. I forced myself to move closer to the water's edge, despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat. If the camera couldn't capture what was in the pond, perhaps I could observe details that would help me understand what I was dealing with. The muddy ground at the water's edge was treacherous, and I had to be careful not to lose my footing as I approached. From this closer vantage point, I could see that the pale shapes weren't floating on the surface as I had initially thought. They were suspended just beneath it, perhaps 6 inches or a foot down, but clearly visible through the dark water. They had a translucent quality that allowed me to see suggestions of internal structure, dark spots and lines that might have been organs or vessels of some kind. As I watched, one of the forms began to rise higher in the water, approaching the surface with deliberate slowness. The water above it began to bulge upward, creating a dome-like distortion that grew more pronounced as the thing beneath drew closer to breaking through. I raised my camera instinctively, knowing it wouldn't capture anything but needing to try anyway. The surface tension finally broke, and a portion of the pale form emerged into the air above the water. What I saw in that moment defied every rational explanation I had tried to construct over the past 3 weeks. The thing that rose from the dark pond was organic but wrong, familiar in its general shape but disturbing in its details. It looked like a face. Not a human face exactly, but something that shared enough characteristics with human features to be recognizable, while remaining utterly alien. There were depressions where eyes might have been, a vertical ridge that could have been a nose, and a horizontal line that suggested a mouth. But the proportions were wrong, the symmetry imperfect, and the entire surface had a texture that looked like it had been underwater for far too long. The face-like form turned slowly in my direction, and I felt a moment of connection, of recognition that chilled me to the bone. Whatever this thing was, it was aware of me not just as a presence in its environment, but as an individual entity. It was studying me with the same focused attention that I was directing toward it. Other forms began to surface around the first, each one slightly different, but sharing the same basic characteristics. They emerged with varying degrees of completeness, some showing only suggestions of features, others revealing more detailed structures that I didn't want to examine too closely. All of them oriented themselves toward my position at the water's edge. I took photograph after photograph, knowing they would show nothing but compelled to try. The camera's mechanical sound seemed to echo strangely in the clearing, bouncing off the water and the surrounding trees in ways that created an almost musical rhythm. But the LCD screen continued to show only empty water, providing no validation for what my eyes were recording. It was when I lowered the camera to check the latest batch of images that I noticed something that made my heart race. While the pale forms remained invisible in the photographs, there was something else present in the water that hadn't been there before. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, shadows that seemed to dart and weave among areas where I could see the pale entities floating. These shadow forms were visible in the camera, appearing as dark streaks and undefined masses that moved through the water with obvious purpose. They seemed to be circling the pale entities, sometimes passing directly beneath them, sometimes approaching close enough to create turbulence in the water above. The presence of these shadow forms in the photographs while the pale entities remained invisible suggested that I was dealing with multiple phenomena, things that existed on different levels of reality or perception. The pale faces could be seen by my eyes but not recorded by the camera, while the dark shadows were invisible to direct observation but showed up clearly in the digital images. The implications were staggering. I was witnessing the intersection of multiple realities, multiple forms of existence that normally remained separate but were somehow overlapping in this hidden location. The dark pond wasn't just a body of water. It was some kind of boundary point, a place where different dimensions or states of being could interact. Penny's barking cut through my theoretical contemplation like a physical blow. She was no longer just distressed, she was terrified, backing away from the clearing with her hackles raised and her tail tucked between her legs. Her barks had taken on a quality I had never heard before, a sound of pure alarm that suggested immediate danger. I looked back toward the water and saw that the situation had changed dramatically. The pale faces were no longer content to float passively at the surface. They were moving, rising higher out of the water, revealing more of their impossible anatomy with each passing moment. And they were no longer arranged in a circle around the dead tree. They were moving toward the shore, toward me. The rational part of my mind insisted that I document this unprecedented event, that I continue taking photographs even though they weren't capturing the most important elements of what was happening. But my survival instincts were stronger than my scientific curiosity. I took one final shot, then turned and ran toward where Penny was waiting at the edge of the tree line. As I ran, I could hear sounds behind me that I didn't want to identify. Wet, sliding noises that suggested movement through muddy ground, and splashing sounds that indicated something large was disturbing the water. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't stop until we were well clear of the valley and climbing toward the familiar ridgeline that would lead us home. But even as we fled, I knew that this encounter had changed something fundamental about my relationship with that place. The entities in the dark pond were no longer content to remain hidden, no longer satisfied with passive observation. They had revealed themselves more completely, had shown me glimpses of their true nature that would be impossible to forget. And most disturbing of all, they had begun to move toward me, suggesting that the boundary between their world and mine was becoming increasingly permeable. Whatever was happening at that remote pond, it was escalating, and I was somehow at the center of it. The weeks following our second encounter at the pond were consumed by obsessive research. I spent hours online, searching through local historical records, geological surveys, and any documentation I could find about our region's natural features. The photographs I had taken, while they didn't show the pale entities, did provide clear evidence of the pond's location and unusual characteristics. I used these images to cross-reference topographical maps and satellite imagery, trying to find any official record of the water body we had discovered. What I found was deeply unsettling. According to every map I could locate, there was no pond in that area of the forest. The topographical surveys showed the valley as a slight depression with seasonal wetlands, but nothing that suggested a permanent body of water large enough to match what we had found. Even recent satellite images from online mapping services showed only dense forest canopy in the location where I knew the pond existed. This discrepancy between observed reality and official documentation suggested that the pond was either a very recent formation, or it existed in some way that made it undetectable to standard surveying methods. Neither possibility was particularly comforting, especially given the strange behavior of my camera during our visits. I expanded my research to include local folklore and historical accounts, searching for any mentions of unusual phenomena in our area. This proved more fruitful, though the information I found raised more questions than it answered. In the county, historical society's digitized archives, I discovered several references to a place called Devil's Mirror, described in 19th century accounts as a dark body of water hidden deep in the forest. According to these old records, Devil's Mirror was discovered by early loggers who avoided the area after several workers reported seeing faces of the drowned in its waters. One account from 1887 described how a logging crew's foreman had vanished near the pond, leaving behind only his boots and hat on the muddy shore. Search parties found no trace of him, and the logging company abandoned their operations in that section of forest, rather than risk losing more men. The historical accounts contained details that matched our discoveries with unsettling accuracy. References to a dead tree standing in the center of the water, descriptions of the pond's perfect stillness, and mentions of the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded the area all aligned with what Penny and I had experienced. But most disturbing were the repeated references to the pond's inhabitants, pale forms that watched from beneath the surface and seemed to draw the living toward the water's edge. I found newspaper clippings from the early 1900s that mentioned several disappearances in the area, always described as hunting or hiking accidents, but with details that suggested something more sinister. In each case, personal belongings were found near bodies of water, but the victims themselves were never recovered. The pattern continued sporadically through the decades, with reports becoming less frequent as the area became more remote and less visited. But the most significant discovery came when I located the personal journal of a forest ranger named William Hayes, who had worked in our area from 1965 to 1989. Hayes had kept detailed records of his patrols and observations, and his journal contained multiple references to what he called the watching pond. His descriptions matched our experiences so precisely that I felt as if he had been writing about our specific encounters. Hayes wrote about finding the pond during a routine patrol in 1967 and being immediately struck by its unnatural characteristics. Like us, He had experienced equipment malfunctions when trying to document the location. His compass spun wildly. Near the water, his radio produced only static and photographs came out strangely distorted or completely blank. He described seeing pale forms in the water that seemed to track his movements and showed signs of intelligence that no natural phenomenon should possess. Most importantly, Hayes had developed a theory about what the pond actually was. Based on his observations over 22 years of monitoring the area, he believed that the water body existed at some kind of dimensional junction point, a place where the normal laws of physics broke down and other realities could intrude into our own. He theorized that the pale entities were inhabitants of this other reality, trapped at the boundary between worlds but capable of limited interaction with our dimension. Hayes's journal entries became increasingly disturbed over the years, suggesting that his repeated exposure to the pond's influence was affecting his mental state. His final entries, dated just weeks before his retirement, described dreams where the pale faces called to him from the dark water, promising answers to questions he had never thought to ask. He wrote about feeling drawn to return to the pond, despite knowing it was dangerous, and about sensing that the entities were becoming more active, more aware of the world beyond their watery prison. The journal ended abruptly with an entry that simply read, "They're getting stronger. The boundary is weakening. God help whoever finds this place next." Hayes had disappeared during a fishing trip in 1990, less than a year after his retirement. His body was never found, though his truck was discovered parked at a trailhead that led directly toward the area where Penny and I had found the pond. Armed with this historical context, I began to understand that our encounters were part of a pattern stretching back over a century. The pond, Devil's Mirror as the old records called it, was a recurring source of unexplained phenomena and mysterious disappearances. Whatever existed in its dark waters had been claiming victims for generations, drawing them close with curiosity before pulling them into depths that no rescue team had ever been able to search. But the most disturbing revelation from my research was the suggestion that the entities in the pond were becoming more active over time. Hayes's observations indicated that their ability to manifest and interact with our reality was growing, stronger, and his final journal entry suggested that this process was accelerating. If his theories were correct, then my repeated visits to the pond might have contributed to this escalation, providing the entities with additional energy or awareness that allowed them to extend their influence. The implications were terrifying. If the boundary between dimensions was indeed weakening, if the pale entities were gaining strength and becoming more capable of affecting our world, then the danger extended far beyond just those foolish enough to visit the pond directly. Eventually, their influence might spread beyond the confines of the dark water, reaching into the surrounding forest and potentially threatening anyone who entered the area. I realized that I faced a terrible choice. I could stay away from the pond, hoping that my absence would allow the situation to stabilize, but knowing that I would never have answers to the questions that haunted me. Or I could return one more time, armed with the knowledge I had gained from my research, and attempt to understand what was really happening in that hidden valley. The decision was made for me when I found Penny standing at our back door early, one morning staring out toward the forest with an intensity that I had never seen before. When she noticed me watching her, she looked back at me with eyes that seemed almost human in their expression of urgent communication. She was trying to tell me something, trying to convey a message that went beyond normal canine behavior. It was then that I realized the entities in the pond weren't content to wait for us to return to them. Somehow, they had established a connection with both of us during our previous visits, a link that was drawing us back whether we wanted to go or not. The obsessive thoughts, the constant awareness of the pond's location, the way it dominated my dreams and waking hours. These weren't just normal human curiosity. They were signs of an influence that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of that dark water. Penny and I were being called, summoned by entities that existed at the intersection of realities. And based on the historical pattern I had uncovered, answering that call had never ended well for anyone who had tried it before us. But ignoring it might be even more dangerous. If the entities were indeed growing stronger, if they were reaching out beyond their watery prison to touch the minds of those who had encountered them, then running away might only delay the inevitable. Eventually, the compulsion would become too strong to resist, and I would find myself walking toward that dark pond whether I chose to or not. The only way to break the cycle was to confront it directly, to return to Devil's Mirror one final time and attempt to understand the true nature of what dwelt in its depths. It was a dangerous choice, one that had apparently claimed the lives of others who had made the same decision. But the alternative, living under the growing influence of entities that existed outside normal reality, was even worse. I began planning our final expedition to the pond, knowing that this time we might not be coming back. I spent 3 days preparing for what I knew would be our last visit to the pond. This time I approached the expedition with the seriousness of someone who might not return, making arrangements that would be necessary if Penny and I simply disappeared into the forest, like so many others before us. I left detailed notes about our discoveries hidden in my room, along with copies of all the research I had conducted and the historical documents I had uncovered. If something happened to us, at least there would be a record of what we had found. The equipment I gathered was more extensive than anything I had brought on previous hikes. Along with the usual supplies of food and water, I packed a waterproof flashlight, extra batteries, a length of rope, and even a small folding shovel that I thought might prove useful if I needed to examine the muddy shore of the pond more closely. Most importantly, I brought 2 cameras, the digital model that had failed to capture the pale entities, and an old film camera that my grandfather had given me years earlier. If there was something about digital technology that prevented proper documentation of what existed in the pond, perhaps analog film would prove more effective. Penny seemed to understand the significance of this final expedition. Her behavior over the past few days had become increasingly strange, alternating between periods of intense alertness and episodes of what could only be described as trance-like fascination. She would stand for hours staring toward the forest, her body rigid and her eyes unfocused, as if she was listening to sounds that I couldn't hear or seeing sights that were invisible to me. When I showed her the hiking gear I had assembled, her reaction was unlike anything I had seen from her before. Instead of the usual excitement that accompanied preparations for our forest adventures, she displayed a resigned acceptance that was almost human in its emotional complexity. She seemed to understand that we were being drawn back to that place against our better judgment, compelled by forces that neither of us fully comprehended. We set out before dawn on a gray October morning, the air crisp with the promise of an early winter. The forest was entering its dormant phase, with most of the leaves fallen and the remaining vegetation taking on the brittle, colorless appearance of approaching death. Our breath formed visible clouds in the cold air, and frost crunched under our boots as we made our way along the familiar trails that would lead us back to the hidden valley. The hike to the pond seemed different this time, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the layers of clothing I wore. The forest was unusually quiet, with none of the bird calls or small animal sounds that normally provided a soundtrack to our expeditions. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. As we descended into the valley, the oppressive atmosphere that I remembered from our previous visits intensified dramatically. The air became thicker, harder to breathe, and carried scents that reminded me of stagnant water and decomposing organic matter. Penny's behavior became increasingly agitated, her movements jerky and unpredictable as she struggled against some invisible compulsion that was drawing her forward. When we finally reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped in shock at what I saw. The pond had changed since our last visit, expanded beyond its previous boundaries to cover nearly the entire floor of the small valley. What had once been dry land was now submerged beneath dark water that reflected the gray sky above like a massive mirror. The dead tree that had stood in the center of the original pond was now just one of several skeletal trunks that protruded from the expanded water surface, their bare branches creating a forest of reaching fingers that broke the water's perfect stillness. But most disturbing of all were the pale forms that were now visible throughout the enlarged pond. Where before I had seen only a handful of entities floating near the original dead tree, now there were dozens of them, arranged in complex patterns that suggested some kind of organization or purpose. They were no longer hiding beneath the surface but floating openly on top of the water, their pale, face-like forms clearly visible from my position at the clearing's edge. Penny whined softly and pressed against my legs, But she didn't retreat as she had during our previous visits. Instead, she seemed transfixed by the sight before us, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and fascination that mirrored my own emotional state. We were both caught between the rational desire to flee and an irrational compulsion to approach the water and discover what the pale entities wanted from us. I raised both cameras and began documenting what we found, taking photographs with both the digital and film models in the hope that one or the other would capture evidence of what we were witnessing. Through the viewfinders, I could see that the expanded pond covered an area that should have been impossible, given the valley's topography. The water extended up the slopes of the surrounding hills, defying gravity and geography in ways that suggested this place operated according to rules that had nothing to do with normal physics. The pale entities began to move as I photographed them, turning their attention toward our position with obvious awareness of our presence. They didn't seem hostile exactly, but there was something in their orientation that suggested purpose, as if our arrival had triggered some predetermined response. Several of them began to drift toward the shore where we stood, moving through the water with smooth, purposeful strokes that left barely visible wakes behind them. As they drew closer, I could see details that had been invisible from a distance. The pale forms were indeed face-like, but they possessed characteristics that no human face should have. Their eyes were dark voids that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their mouths were horizontal slits that occasionally opened to reveal depths that extended far beyond what should have been possible. Most disturbing of all, their features seemed to shift and change as I watched, as if they were not quite solid, not quite permanent in their physical form. One of the entities reached the shore and began to emerge from the water, revealing more of its impossible anatomy with each passing moment. What rose from the dark pond was roughly humanoid but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that defied skeletal structure and skin that had the translucent quality of something that had never been exposed to sunlight. Penny began to bark, her voice high and desperate as she tried to warn me away from the approaching entity. But her bark sounded strange in the oppressive atmosphere of the valley, muffled and distorted as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. I found myself unable to retreat, transfixed by the sight of something that clearly didn't belong in any reality I understood. The entity stopped at the water's edge and extended what might have been an arm toward me. Its limbs stretched much farther than should have been anatomically possible, reaching across the 10 feet of muddy ground that separated us. At the end of the impossibly long appendage was something that resembled a hand, but possessed too many fingers, each one ending in what looked like a small dark eye. I understood then that this was what had been calling to me, drawing me back to this place through dreams and obsessive thoughts. The entity wanted something from me, needed something that I possessed. But what it was offering in return was a knowledge that no human mind was equipped to process, an understanding of realities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience. As the impossible hand reached toward me, I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of taking the offered appendage, instead of allowing myself to be drawn into whatever existence these entities inhabited, I grabbed Penny's collar and ran. We fled from that valley as if our lives depended on it, and perhaps they did. Behind us, I could hear sounds that I had no names for, wet sliding noises that suggested movement through impossible spaces, and what might have been voices calling in languages that predated human speech. But I didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't stop running until we were miles away from that cursed place. When we finally reached home, both of us exhausted and traumatized by what we had experienced, I immediately began making plans to leave the area. I couldn't live knowing that such a place existed so close to our home. Couldn't sleep peacefully knowing that entities from other realities were expanding their influence into our world. Within a week, I had convinced my parents that I needed to transfer to a college in another state, and by the end of the month, we had moved away from that small town and its hidden horrors. But even now, 5 years later and hundreds of miles away from that dark pond, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the certainty that something is calling to me from across the distance. In my dreams, I see pale faces floating in dark water, their impossible eyes fixed on me with patient, eternal attention. They are waiting, I know, for me to return and accept what they offered that day in the hidden valley. The photographs I took during our final visit developed exactly as I had expected. The digital images showed only empty water and dead trees, while the film photographs revealed the expanded pond in all its impossible glory, but captured no trace of the pale entities that I knew inhabited its depths. It was as if they existed in a spectrum of reality that no technology could record, visible only to minds that had been touched by their influence. I kept both sets of photographs as evidence of what we had discovered, but I've never shown them to anyone else. Who would believe such a story? Who would accept that there are places in our world where other realities intrude, where entities that exist outside normal experience can reach across dimensional boundaries to touch the minds of the living? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had taken that offered hand, if I had allowed myself to be drawn into the dark water with its patient, waiting inhabitants. Would I have gained the knowledge they seemed eager to share? Or would I have simply become another unexplained disappearance, another name added to the long list of those who had vanished near Devil's Mirror? I'll never know, and perhaps that's for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some realities too alien to comprehend. The pale entities in that dark pond represent something that exists beyond human understanding, something that our minds are not equipped to process without losing our sanity in the attempt. But they are still there, I know, waiting in their expanded realm at the intersection of realities. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can feel them calling to me across the miles, patient and eternal in their alien purpose. They know that eventually curiosity will overcome caution, and someone else will find their way to that hidden valley. When that happens, I can only pray that the next visitor will be wiser than I was, strong enough to resist the terrible fascination of those pale, watching faces. Because once you've seen what dwells in the depths of Devil's Mirror, once you've felt the touch of their impossible attention, you can never quite escape the knowledge that there are things in this world that should never be disturbed. The dark pond remains, and its inhabitants continue their patient vigil, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon their watery realm. And when that day comes, as I know it inevitably will, another chapter will be added to the long, dark history of that cursed place, where realities intersect and nightmares take physical form. I can only hope that whoever finds them next will have the wisdom to run, as Penny and I finally did, before it's too late to escape the mesmerizing pull of those pale, eternal watchers in the depths of the dark pond. The scorching heat of August 1987 had settled over our small county like a suffocating blanket. I was 3 years into my career as a sheriff's deputy, still carrying the eager determination of youth, but beginning to understand the weight that comes with wearing the badge. At 26, I thought I'd seen enough of human nature's darker side through domestic disputes and bar fights. But nothing had prepared me for what was waiting in those ancient woods. My uncle had been the one to suggest I volunteer for search and rescue duty. "You've got the stamina for it," he'd said, "and the heart." What he didn't mention was how the screaming silence of missing persons cases would follow you home, how you'd wake up in cold sweats wondering if you'd missed some crucial detail that could have saved a life. The phone rang at the station that Tuesday morning, August 18th, cutting through the humid air like a blade. Sheriff Rodriguez handed me the receiver with a grim expression that I'd come to recognize. Another missing persons case. "Deputy Morrison speaking," I answered, already reaching for my notepad. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez from Phoenix, Arizona. Her words came in rushed, panicked bursts between barely controlled sobs. Her husband, Vicente, age 54, and their 9-year-old grandson, Diego, had driven up to our mountain region the previous Thursday for what was supposed to be a 4-day camping and fishing trip. They should have returned Sunday evening. It was now Tuesday, and she hadn't heard a word from them. "Vicente always calls," she kept repeating, her voice breaking. "Every night when he's away, he calls to check in. Always. Even when the phone service is bad, he finds a way. Something's wrong. I can feel it in my bones." As I took down the details, their planned route, the make and model of their blue Ford pickup, Vicente's medical conditions, diabetes requiring daily insulin, Diego's fear of the dark, a familiar knot formed in my stomach. The boy's age hit me hardest. 9 years old. The same age I'd been when my own father took me on my first camping trip, teaching me to tie knots and identify animal tracks. Mrs. Gonzalez provided their intended campsite location, Deadwater Creek, about 15 miles into the wilderness area. It was accessible by logging roads, but surrounded by thousands of acres of dense forest that stretched toward the Canadian border. The area was known for its sudden weather changes, hidden ravines, and easy-to-miss trail markers. Even experienced hikers had gotten turned around out there. After hanging up, I stared at the topographical map pinned to the station wall. Deadwater Creek sat in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, with old-growth timber so thick that helicopters couldn't see through the canopy. If someone got lost in there, especially a diabetic man with a young child, time wasn't on our side. Sheriff Rodriguez assembled our search and rescue team within the hour. Besides myself, we had 4 other deputies. Martinez, a 15-year veteran with a tracker's instincts. Wilson, built like a linebacker but gentle as a lamb with scared kids. Torres, our communications specialist who could make radios work in dead zones. And Hansen, fresh out of the academy but eager to prove himself. Our civilian volunteer team consisted of 12 locals who knew these mountains better than their own backyards. There was old Pete, a retired logger whose weathered hands could read terrain like Braille. The Morrison twins, no relation to me, identical brothers who ran the local outdoor gear shop. Susan Walsh, a school nurse who'd patched up more hiking accidents than our county hospital. And 8 others whose knowledge of wilderness survival had saved lives before. The real stars of our operation were the dogs, Buster and Sadie, 2 German shepherds trained in tracking and trained by the state police. Their handler, Deputy Craig Williams from the neighboring county, had driven up specifically for this search. These animals could follow a scent trail days old and had found more missing persons than the rest of us combined. We loaded our vehicles with enough supplies for a week-long search: medical equipment, emergency shelter materials, ropes and climbing gear, extra food and water, flare guns, portable radios with extended batteries, and enough coffee to keep a small army awake. I packed my personal kit with extra care, checking and rechecking my first aid supplies, my compass, and the emergency insulin that might save Vicente's life if we found him in time. The drive to Deadwater Creek took us deeper into wilderness with each mile. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt paths barely wide enough for our vehicles. Ancient Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches interlocking to form a green ceiling that blocked out most of the sky. The temperature dropped 10 degrees as we climbed elevation, and the air grew thick with the smell of pine resin and decomposing leaves. As we bumped along the final stretch of logging road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from between the trees. Every deputy develops instincts about danger, and mine were screaming that this case would be different from the routine searches I'd participated in before. The forest seemed to press in around us, too quiet except for the rumble of our engines and the occasional crack of a branch in the wind. We reached the Deadwater Creek campground just after noon, the August sun barely penetrating the thick canopy of ancient evergreens. The campground was more of a clearing than anything else, a rough circle of packed earth surrounded by towering trees that seemed to lean inward, as if listening to secrets whispered in the center. Vicente's blue Ford pickup sat exactly where Mrs. Gonzalez said it would be, parked near the creek bank with military precision. The truck bed was empty except for a spare tire and some basic tools, nothing unusual there. What immediately caught my attention was the complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. The only noise came from the creek itself, a low gurgling that sounded disturbingly like muffled conversation. Their orange dome tent was pitched about 30 feet from the truck, still standing but with the rain fly hanging loose on one side. Deputy Martinez approached it carefully, his hand resting on his service weapon out of habit. "Tent's not secured properly," he called out. "Looks like they left in a hurry." I joined him at the tent entrance, and what we found inside made my skin crawl. Everything was still there: wallet, truck keys, camping permits, a detailed topographical map with their planned hiking routes marked in red ink, bottles of water, canned food, a first aid kit, and most troubling of all, Vicente's insulin and testing kit sitting on top of his sleeping bag. A diabetic doesn't go anywhere without his medication, not willingly. The sleeping bags were unzipped and pushed aside, as if both occupants had gotten up quickly in the middle of the night. Diego's small backpack contained comic books, a handheld electronic game, and a worn teddy bear with one missing eye. The sight of that bear, obviously well-loved and carried everywhere, made my chest tighten. What 9-year-old leaves his security blanket behind? Deputy Wilson was examining the cold fire pit when he called us over. "Take a look at this," he said, pointing at a small camping pot sitting on the metal grate above the ashes. The pot was half filled with water and what had once been macaroni noodles, now bloated and gray with several days of sitting. Floating on the surface was a thin film of green algae, and tiny insects had made homes in the congealed mess. "They were cooking dinner," I said, studying the scene. "This pot wouldn't sit on the grate unless the fire was still burning, which means they left while their food was still cooking." Old Pete knelt beside the fire pit and stirred the ashes with a stick. "Fire's been dead for days, 3, maybe 4. And look here." He pointed to scattered pieces of partially burned wood around the pit's perimeter. "These logs were pulled out of the fire while they were still burning. See the charred ends? Someone yanked these out fast and threw them aside." The implication sent a chill through me despite the August heat. People don't abandon a hot meal and actively extinguish their fire unless something forces them to leave immediately. Fear, panic, threat. We spent the next hour searching the immediate area around the campsite for any signs of struggle or clues about what direction they might have gone. Deputy Torres set up our communications equipment, while Susan Walsh and the Morrison twins began organizing our search supplies. The tracking dogs arrived with Deputy Williams, both animals eager to work but strangely agitated in ways their handler had never seen before. "Buster keeps whining and circling back to the truck," Williams told me, scratching his head. "And Sadie won't stop staring at those trees over there." He pointed toward the northern edge of the clearing, where the forest grew particularly dense. "I've never seen them act like this. It's like they can smell something that's making them nervous." We gave the dogs articles of clothing from the tent, one of Vicente's shirts and a pair of Diego's socks. Both animals caught the scent immediately, their tails wagging as they put their noses to the ground. But instead of heading off in a clear direction like we expected, they began moving in seemingly random patterns around the campsite. Buster would pick up a trail heading east toward the creek, follow it for maybe 50 yards, then stop abruptly and whine. Sadie would find tracks going north into the heavy timber, but after 30 or 40 yards, she'd circle back with her ears flat against her head, a sure sign of canine confusion or fear. "I don't understand this," Williams muttered, watching his dog's unusual behavior. "It's like the scent trail starts and stops in random places. How does that happen? People don't just vanish into thin air and reappear somewhere else." Deputy Martinez was having similar problems with the physical evidence. "I found boot prints here," he called from near the creek bank. "Adult-sized, probably Vicente's. But they just stop at the water's edge, and I can't find any corresponding prints on the other side." Like he walked to the water and disappeared. 40 feet away, Hansen discovered something even more puzzling. "Got smaller prints over here, child-sized. They lead from the tent toward those big boulders, but then..." He gestured helplessly at a flat area of bare rock. "Nothing. The trail just ends." As the afternoon wore on, we discovered more of these incomplete trails scattered around the campsite and extending into the surrounding forest. Boot prints that appeared suddenly in soft earth with no indication of how they'd gotten there. Broken branches at adult height in areas where no footprints existed on the ground below. A child's candy bar wrapper stuck to a tree branch 8 feet off the ground, too high for 9-year-old Diego to have placed it there himself. The physical evidence was telling a story that made no logical sense, and the dog's behavior was becoming more erratic with each passing hour. Both animals would start following a trail with confidence, only to stop suddenly and bark at empty air, their hackles raised as if confronting an invisible threat. As the sun began its descent toward the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the campsite, I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Despite the strange evidence and the dog's nervous behavior, we had 2 people missing in wilderness that could kill them within days. Whether the clues made sense or not, we had to start searching. "We'll use a standard grid pattern," I announced to the team. "Martinez and Wilson take the eastern sector toward Copper Ridge. Torres and Hansen cover the southern approach to Deadwater Falls. The volunteers will work in pairs covering the western slopes." I looked at the northern tree line, where the forest seemed to swallow light itself. "I'll take that sector with Deputy Williams and the dogs. Something up there has their attention, and I want to know what it is." As we prepared to head out, old Pete approached me with a concerned expression. Deputy Morrison, he said quietly. I've been hunting and fishing these mountains for 40 years. I've never seen anything like what we found here today. You watch yourself out there. This doesn't feel right. The northern sector stretched before us like an open mouth, dark and uninviting despite the afternoon sun still filtering through the canopy above. Deputy Williams and I moved carefully through the undergrowth, following Buster and Sadie as they worked the scent trails with increasing agitation. The deeper we went into the forest, the more unnatural everything felt. The silence was the first thing that struck me as wrong. In healthy forest, you should hear birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush. Here, there was nothing but the soft crunch of our boots on dead leaves and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. Even our own breathing seemed muffled, as if the trees themselves were absorbing sound. "Williams?" I called softly, not wanting to speak too loudly in the oppressive quiet. "How long have you been working with these dogs?" 5 years, he replied, keeping pace beside me while watching his animals closely. Never seen them act like this. Look at Sadie's ears, they're pinned back, but she's still following the scent. That's fear behavior mixed with working drive. Dogs don't usually show both at the same time. As if to emphasize his point, Buster suddenly stopped dead in his tracks about 20 yards ahead of us. The German Shepherd's entire body went rigid, his tail dropping low as he stared at something we couldn't see. A low whine escaped his throat, the kind of sound a dog makes when it's trying to warn you about danger it can't explain. We approached slowly, hands instinctively moving toward our weapons. Buster was fixated on a cluster of large Douglas firs, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle one. The ground between them was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a soft brown surface that should have held tracks clearly. "There," Williams whispered, pointing at the base of the largest tree. "Boot prints." The prints were unmistakably human, adult-sized boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel that matched the impressions we'd found back at the campsite. But these prints were different. They appeared suddenly in the middle of the soft needle bed, with no trail leading to them from any direction. It was as if Vicente had materialized at that spot, taken several steps in a small circle, then vanished again. More disturbing was the depth of the impressions. The prints were pressed deep into the soft earth, deeper than a normal walking gait would create. Someone had been standing there, shifting his weight back and forth with considerable force. Pacing, or struggling. Sadie had moved to a spot about 15 feet away, her nose pressed to the ground as she worked another scent trail. This one led to a small clearing where we found signs that made my blood pressure spike. Scuff marks in the dirt. Several broken branches at waist height, snapped cleanly as if someone had been pushed or dragged through them. And most chilling of all, a small piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush at exactly the height of a 9-year-old child. The fabric was blue denim torn raggedly as if ripped away by force. Williams photographed it carefully before I removed it with tweezers, sealing it in an evidence bag. The material was still relatively fresh, not weathered by days of exposure to the elements. "Deputy Morrison," Williams said, his voice tight with concern. "Look at this pattern we're seeing. Random scent trails that appear and disappear. Signs of struggle in isolated spots with no connecting evidence. It's like these people were moved around the forest instead of walking through it." The implications of his observation made my stomach turn. "Moved by what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Or who?" he replied grimly. We spent the next 2 hours working deeper into the northern sector, following the dogs as they led us from one inexplicable scent pocket to another. The pattern continued, evidence of human presence in scattered locations with no logical connections between them. A child's shoe print pressed into mud beside a small stream, but no corresponding prints approaching or leaving the area. Adult-sized, handprints pressed into the bark of a tree at shoulder height, as if someone had been pushed against it with considerable force. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, the temperature began to drop noticeably. What had started as a warm August day was turning into something much cooler, and the air carried a dampness that seemed to seep through our clothing. The forest around us was changing too, becoming darker and more oppressive with each step we took away from the campsite. The trees grew larger and closer together the deeper we went, their branches interlocking overhead to form an almost solid canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. The undergrowth became thicker and more tangled, forcing us to push through walls of ferns and brambles that caught at our clothing and equipment. It was in one of these dense thickets that we made our most disturbing discovery. Sadie had been working a particularly strong scent trail when she suddenly stopped and began to bark. Not her normal working bark, but a high-pitched, frightened sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. She was focused on a large fallen log that had created a natural shelter in the undergrowth. Williams called her back and approached the log carefully, his flashlight beam dancing across the shadowy space beneath it. "God Almighty," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I joined him and immediately understood his reaction. Scratched into the soft earth beneath the log were desperate markings, words gouged into the dirt with a stick or finger. The letters were uneven and hard to read, clearly made by someone under extreme stress, but the message was unmistakable. "Help us." Below that, in smaller, more frantic letters, "They took Diego." The words hit me like a physical blow. Vicente had been here, recently enough that rain hadn't washed away his message. He'd been conscious, coherent, and desperate enough to leave this plea for help. But where was he now? And who had taken his grandson? Williams was photographing the scratched message when both dogs suddenly went into full alert mode. Their ears perked up, heads turning toward the north, deeper into the forest. A sound was drifting through the trees, faint but unmistakably human. Voices. Calling. "Diego." The voice was distant but clear, filled with anguish and desperation. "Diego, where are you?" It was Vicente. He was alive, and he was somewhere in the forest ahead of us, still searching for his grandson. Williams and I looked at each other for a split second before we both started moving, crashing through the underbrush toward the sound of that desperate voice. "Vicente!" I shouted as we ran. "Vicente Gonzalez! This is the sheriff's department. We're here to help you." The calling stopped abruptly. The forest fell back into its unnatural silence, as if our voices had been swallowed by the trees themselves. We stopped running and listened intently, straining to hear any response, any indication of which direction the voice had come from. Nothing, just the whisper of wind through the branches and the sound of our own labored breathing. "Vicente!" Williams called out, his voice echoing strangely in the dense timber. "We're search and rescue. Call out if you can hear us." Still nothing. It was as if the voice had never existed, as if the forest had played a cruel trick on our desperate ears. But both dogs were still alert, still focused on something ahead of us in the darkness between the trees. As the last rays of sunlight began to fade from the sky above the canopy, I made the decision to return to the campsite and regroup with the rest of the search team. Whatever was happening in these woods was beyond anything I'd encountered in 3 years of search and rescue work, and I wasn't about to risk losing more people in the darkness. The hike back to the campsite felt longer than it should have, as if the forest itself was trying to confuse our sense of direction. Twice Williams had to consult his compass to make sure we were heading the right way, and both times we discovered we'd been veering off course without realizing it. By the time we emerged from the tree line into the clearing where Vicente's truck waited, full darkness had settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. The other search teams had already returned and were gathered around a large campfire, their faces grim with the day's disappointing results. Nobody had found any trace of Diego, and now, with Vicente's desperate message burned into my memory, I knew we were dealing with something far worse than a simple case of people getting lost in the woods. The debriefing around the campfire revealed a pattern that chilled me more than the mountain air. Every search team had encountered the same inexplicable evidence: scent trails that appeared and disappeared without logical connection, signs of human presence in impossible locations, and an overwhelming sense that something in the forest was actively working against our efforts. Deputy Martinez reported finding Diego's other shoe wedged in the fork of a tree branch 12 feet off the ground, with no indication of how it had gotten there. The Morrison twins had discovered adult-sized footprints pressed into soft mud at the bottom of a steep ravine. but no corresponding prints on either side showing how someone could have reached that spot without rappelling equipment. Most disturbing was Susan Walsh's report from the western sector. Her team had found a section of disturbed earth near Copper Creek where the ground showed clear signs of a struggle: torn vegetation, scuffed dirt, broken branches. But when they tried to follow any trails leading away from the scene, they found nothing. The evidence of conflict simply existed in isolation, surrounded by undisturbed forest. "It doesn't make sense," Martinez said, poking at the fire with a stick. "People don't just teleport around the wilderness. There has to be a logical explanation for what we're seeing." Old Pete, who had been listening quietly from the edge of the group, finally spoke up. "I've seen animals moved like this," he said slowly. "When predators cache their prey, drag it to one location then another, storing it for later consumption." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Deputy Torres was the first to break it. "You're talking about bears," he said, his voice hopeful. "Black bears will move carcasses to different locations." "Bears don't scratch messages in the dirt asking for help," I replied grimly. "And they don't take children's shoes and hang them in trees." Williams nodded in agreement. "Besides, the dogs would react differently to bear scent. What we're seeing is something else entirely." As we continued to discuss the day's findings, I noticed that the forest around our campsite had begun to feel different. The oppressive silence I'd noticed during the day had been replaced by something that might have been worse: the sense that we were being watched. Every time I looked up from the fire toward the tree line, I expected to see eyes reflecting our firelight from the darkness. The dogs felt it too. Buster and Sadie, who should have been resting after a hard day's work, remained alert and on edge. They positioned themselves between our group and the northern tree line, occasionally letting out low growls at sounds or movements that we couldn't detect. "We need to establish a watch rotation," I announced. "2 people awake at all times, keeping the fire burning and the dogs close. Something about this situation doesn't feel right, and I don't want to take any chances." Deputy Hanson, eager to prove himself, volunteered for the first watch along with old Pete. The rest of us settled into our sleeping bags, arranged in a rough circle around the fire, weapons within easy reach. Despite the exhaustion from a full day of hiking and searching, I found myself staring up at the stars visible through breaks in the canopy. The night sounds of the forest seemed muted and wrong. Instead of the normal chorus of owls, nightbirds, and small animals that should have filled the darkness, we heard only the occasional crack of a branch in the distance and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. Even the creek's gurgling seemed subdued, as if it were trying not to draw attention to itself. I must have dozed off despite my intentions to stay alert, because the next thing I knew, Deputy Hanson was shaking my shoulder urgently. "Deputy Morrison," he whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "You need to see this." I sat up immediately, automatically reaching for my service weapon as I scanned the campsite. The fire was still burning brightly, casting dancing shadows across our sleeping area. Old Pete was standing near the northern edge of the clearing, his hunting rifle cradled in his arms as he stared intently into the darkness between the trees. "What's the situation?" I asked quietly, not wanting to wake the others unnecessarily. "About 20 minutes ago, we started hearing sounds from the woods," Hanson explained, his words coming in rushed whispers. "Not animal sounds. Human sounds, like someone moving through the brush trying to be quiet but not succeeding." Old Pete joined us, never taking his eyes off the tree line. "Started with just rustling leaves and snapping twigs," he said. "Normal sounds, except they were too regular, too purposeful, like someone walking in circles around our camp, staying just far enough back that we couldn't see them. Then came the whistling," Hanson added, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Whistling?" I asked, though I had a terrible suspicion about what he was going to tell me. "Wolf whistles," old Pete confirmed. 3 of them, spaced maybe 5 minutes apart, coming from different directions each time. First from the north, then east, then south, like whoever's out there is moving around us. The implications hit me immediately. Wolf whistles weren't a natural sound. They were distinctly human, the kind of catcall whistle men might make at an attractive woman. There was no innocent explanation for hearing them in the middle of wilderness at 2 in the morning. "Did you try calling out?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Called out each time, Hansen replied. Identified ourselves as law enforcement. Asked if anyone needed help. No response. The sounds just stopped for a few minutes, then started up again from a different location. As if summoned by our conversation, a clear wolf whistle drifted out of the darkness from somewhere beyond the eastern edge of our campsite. The sound was unmistakably human, unmistakably deliberate, and unmistakably threatening in its context. This wasn't someone lost and trying to attract our attention. This was someone playing games with us. I was on my feet immediately, flashlight in one hand and weapon in the other.
Hello?
I called out toward the source of the sound. This is Deputy Morrison with the county sheriff's office. Identify yourself. The only response was another wolf whistle, this one from the complete opposite direction, somewhere in the trees behind our campsite. Whoever was out there had moved at least 100 yards in the few seconds since the first whistle. Either we were dealing with multiple people, or someone with an intimate knowledge of the terrain who could move through the forest in complete darkness without making noise. Williams was awake now, both dogs pressed against his legs and growling low in their throats. Martinez and Wilson were sitting up in their sleeping bags, hands on their weapons as they scanned the darkness around us. Torres was already reaching for his radio equipment. Torres, can you raise dispatch? I asked quietly. He tried for several minutes, adjusting frequencies and antenna positions, but got nothing but static. Something's interfering with the signal, he reported. Could be the terrain, or atmospheric conditions, or... He paused, unwilling to voice the darker possibility that someone might be jamming our communications deliberately. A third wolf whistle came from the north, the same direction where Williams and I had found Vicente's desperate message scratched in the dirt. This time the sound seemed closer, as if whoever was making it was growing bolder, tightening their circle around our campsite. That's enough, I said, making a decision that I hoped wouldn't get anyone killed. Martinez, Wilson, you're with me. We're going to find out who's playing games in our investigation. Deputy Morrison, old Pete said quietly. Maybe that's exactly what they want us to do. Split up, leave the campsite undefended. His words gave me pause. The tactical situation was everything law enforcement training warns against. Unknown number of suspects, unfamiliar terrain, limited visibility, compromised communications. But 2 people were still missing in this forest, and someone was actively taunting the search and rescue team sent to find them. Another whistle, closer still, made the decision for me. We stick together, I announced. Everyone up, gear on, weapons ready. We're going to investigate as a group, keeping the campfire between us and the tree line. As we prepared to move out, both tracking dogs began exhibiting behavior I'd never seen before. Instead of focusing on the direction of the whistles like trained tracking animals should, they kept circling back to Vicente's truck, whining and pawing at the vehicle as if trying to tell us something. What's wrong with them? Williams muttered, attempting to get Buster to focus on the scent trails we'd established earlier. I walked over to the truck and examined it more carefully with my flashlight. The vehicle looked exactly as it had when we'd arrived, locked, undisturbed, covered with a light layer of dust from the dirt road. But as I played my light across the truck bed, something caught my attention. There, pressed into the thin layer of dust on the tailgate, were handprints. Small handprints exactly the size a 9-year-old boy would make. They weren't there when we'd arrived that morning. I was certain of it, because I'd examined the truck thoroughly as part of our initial investigation. Someone had been at Vicente's truck while we were sleeping. Someone small enough to be Diego himself, or someone who wanted us to think Diego had been there. The wolf whistles started up again, but this time they came in rapid succession from multiple directions, creating an eerie chorus that seemed to surround our campsite entirely. The sound echoed off the trees and rocks, making it impossible to pinpoint exact locations, but one thing was clear. We were outnumbered. As the last whistle faded into the night, a new sound replaced it. Somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight, someone was calling out in a voice filled with terror and desperation. Help me. Please, somebody help me. It was Diego's voice. The sound of Diego's terrified plea cut through the night air like a knife, galvanizing our entire team into immediate action. Williams released both dogs, and they bounded toward the northern tree line where the voice had originated, their powerful forms disappearing into the shadows beyond our firelight. Diego! I shouted, following the dogs into the darkness. Diego, we're here. Keep calling so we can find you. Behind me, I could hear the rest of the team crashing through the underbrush, flashlight beams dancing wildly as we pursued the sound of that desperate young voice. The forest seemed to swallow our lights, the thick canopy overhead blocking out even the faintest starlight, leaving us in a maze of shadows and tree trunks. Over here! Diego's voice called again, but now it seemed to be coming from a completely different direction, somewhere off to our left. We changed course, stumbling over fallen logs and pushing through brambles that tore at our clothing and equipment. Williams was ahead of us, following his dog's frantic barking, when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Morrison! He called back, his voice filled with confusion and growing alarm. The dogs are circling. They can't lock onto a specific direction. I reached his position and saw what he meant. Buster and Sadie were running in tight circles around a small clearing, whining and barking at empty air. Their behavior was completely contrary to their training. Tracking dogs should follow a scent trail in a straight line toward their target, not run in confused circles. Please. Diego's voice came again, closer now but still impossible to pinpoint. I can't find Grandpa. Someone took him. They're coming back for me. The raw terror in that young voice drove us deeper into the forest, following what seemed like a deliberate path through the trees. But as we pursued the sound, a horrible realization began to dawn on me. Each time Diego called out, his voice came from a different location, but the distance seemed to remain constant. It was as if the source of the voice was moving parallel to us, staying just far enough ahead to remain out of sight. Diego, Martinez called out. Stay where you are. Don't move. We're coming to get you. I can't, came the reply now from somewhere behind us. They won't let me. They keep moving me. That response stopped me cold. I held up my hand, signaling the team to halt, and we all stood in the darkness listening intently. For a moment, the forest was completely silent except for the sound of our own heavy breathing and the dogs' continued whining. Then Diego's voice came again, but this time there was something wrong with it. The words were the same, help me. Please, somebody help me. But the tone was slightly off. Too measured. Too clear for a 9-year-old boy who had been lost in the wilderness for days. Williams heard it too. That's a recording, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone's playing a recording of the kid's voice. The implications of his realization hit all of us simultaneously. We'd been led deep into the forest, away from our defensible campsite, chasing the sound of a recording. We'd been manipulated, drawn into exactly the kind of tactical situation that gets law enforcement officers killed. Back to camp, I ordered immediately. Now, stay together, weapons ready. As we turned to retrace our steps, Diego's voice started up again, but this time it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The same terrified plea, help me! Please, somebody help me, was being broadcast from different locations around us, creating a disorienting echo effect that made it impossible to determine which direction was which. The dogs were going crazy, running from one voice to another, unable to understand why their noses couldn't locate the source of the sounds they were hearing. Williams called them back, clipping leashes to their collars to keep them close as we tried to navigate back to our campsite. But finding our way back proved more difficult than it should have been. The forest in darkness looked completely different from the route we'd taken following the recording. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks seemed to have moved, and paths that we'd clearly marked with broken branches appeared to have vanished entirely. Which way? Hansen asked, playing his flashlight beam in all directions. Everything looks the same. Torres consulted his compass, but the needle was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Compass is malfunctioning, he reported. Must be mineral deposits in the area affecting the magnetism. The recording of Diego's voice continued to play around us, sometimes close enough that it seemed like the boy should be visible in our flashlight beams, other times distant enough to be barely audible. The pattern was clearly designed to confuse and disorient us, and it was working. Old Pete, whose lifetime of experience in these mountains should have made him our most reliable guide, was having as much trouble as the rest of us. I don't understand it, he muttered, studying the terrain with his flashlight. This area should be familiar to me, but nothing looks right. As we continued searching for the path back to camp, The forest around us began to feel increasingly hostile. The recorded pleas for help took on a mocking quality, as if whoever was controlling them was enjoying our confusion. Worse, other sounds began to join the chorus, adult voices calling out in Spanish, obviously Vicente pleading for his grandson's safety. "Diego, where are you?" The man's voice was filled with anguish, clearly authentic recordings of Vicente's desperate search for his missing grandson. "Please, I need my medicine. I can't keep going much longer." The psychological warfare was effective. Every instinct we had as law enforcement officers and human beings was to respond to those cries for help, even knowing they were recordings. The emotional manipulation was designed to cloud our judgment and keep us moving in circles through the dark forest. Martinez was the first to spot the orange glow filtering through the trees ahead of us. "There," he said, pointing toward what had to be our campfire. "Camp's that way." We moved toward the light as quickly as the terrain would allow, eager to get back to our defensive position and regroup. But as we got closer, something seemed wrong with the scene ahead of us. The glow was too bright, too large for the campfire we'd left burning. When we finally pushed through the last line of trees into the clearing, we found our worst fears confirmed. Our campsite was in flames, not just the fire pit but Vicente's truck. Our tents, our supplies, everything we'd left behind was burning with an intensity that suggested accelerant had been used. The heat was overwhelming, forcing us to stay back at the tree line as we watched our equipment and evidence go up in smoke. The truck's gas tank exploded as we stood there, sending a mushroom of flame and black smoke high into the night sky. "Our radios," Torres said numbly, watching the communications equipment melt in the inferno. "Our food, our medical supplies, everything." Williams was staring at the destruction with a different kind of horror. "The evidence," he said. "All the photographs, the samples we collected." Vicente's message scratched in the dirt. "It's all gone." The burning campsite illuminated the forest around us in a hellish orange glow, and in that flickering light I finally saw them. Silhouettes moving between the trees on the far side of the clearing, barely visible through the smoke and flames. At least 6 figures standing motionless as they watched our equipment burn. They were too far away to make out details, but their stillness was somehow more threatening than if they'd been advancing toward us. They simply stood there in the shadows, observing our situation with what seemed like satisfaction. "There," I said quietly, pointing toward the figures. 6 o'clock just inside the tree line. The rest of the team followed my gaze and weapons were drawn immediately. But even as we prepared to confront whoever had destroyed our camp, the figures began to fade back into the forest, disappearing one by one until there was nothing left but dancing shadows cast by the flames. "Spread out," I ordered. "Perimeter formation. These people have been playing games with us all night, and now they've just escalated to arson and destruction of evidence. No one moves alone. If you see anything at all, you call it out immediately." As we took defensive positions around the burning campsite, the recorded voices of Diego and Vicente finally fell silent. The forest returned to its unnatural quiet, broken only by the crackling of flames and the occasional pop of something exploding in the fire. We were stranded now, miles from the nearest road without transportation or communication equipment, facing an unknown number of adversaries who had demonstrated both tactical planning and complete willingness to escalate the situation. Dawn was still hours away, and we had no way to call for backup. The hunt for 2 missing people had become something far more dangerous. We were no longer the hunters. We had become the prey. The flames from our destroyed campsite finally began to die down as the first pale hints of dawn crept over the eastern ridgeline. Vicente's truck was nothing but a twisted metal skeleton, still radiating heat that kept us at a distance. Our equipment, our supplies, our evidence, all reduced to ash and melted plastic. As the growing daylight allowed us to survey the full extent of the destruction, the tactical reality of our situation became clear. We were approximately 15 miles from the nearest logging road, without transportation, without communication equipment, and without the medical supplies that could keep us alive if anyone was seriously injured. Williams was examining what remained of our supply cache when he made a discovery that sent ice through my veins. "Morrison," he called softly, "you need to see this." In the soft earth near where our medical kit had been stored, pressed clearly into the dirt, was a perfect boot print. Adult-sized, with the distinctive wear pattern on the left heel that we'd been tracking for the past 2 days. Vicente's boot print. But this print was fresh, made after the fire had been set while the ground was still soft from the heat and moisture, which meant Vicente had been here at our campsite while we were chasing recordings of his grandson's voice through the forest. "That's impossible," Martinez said, studying the print. "We've been searching for this guy for 2 days. Why would he be here, at our camp, instead of trying to signal for help?" Old Pete knelt beside the print, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading sign in the wilderness. "This wasn't made by someone walking normally," he said quietly. "Look at the depth, the way the heel dug in. This is the print of someone who was struggling, being dragged or carried." The implications were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly disturbing. Vicente hadn't destroyed our campsite. He'd been brought here, possibly unconscious, possibly as a witness to the destruction of our rescue operation. Deputy Torres was working frantically with the remains of our radio equipment, trying to salvage anything that might allow us to communicate with the outside world. "It's no use," he finally announced. "Everything's melted beyond repair. We're completely cut off." As full daylight settled over the burned clearing, I made the decision that had been forming in my mind throughout the long night. "We're hiking out," I announced. "All of us together, following the logging road back to civilization. We'll send backup to continue the search once we've reported what happened here." "What about Vicente and Diego?" Hansen asked. "We can't just abandon them." "We're not abandoning them," I replied grimly. "But we're also not going to add 6 more missing persons to the situation. Whatever's happening in this forest is beyond the scope of a standard search and rescue operation." Williams was securing his dogs for the long hike when Buster suddenly went rigid. His attention focused on the northern tree line where we'd found so much strange evidence the day before. Both animals were exhibiting the same alert behavior they'd shown throughout our search. But now their focus seemed more specific, more urgent. "They've got something," Williams said, following his dog's gaze toward the forest. "Something definite this time." I followed his line of sight and felt my blood freeze. There, just barely visible in the shadows between the trees, stood 2 figures. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking what we were seeing. An adult and a child watching us from the edge of the forest. "Vicente," I called out, starting toward the tree line. "Diego, we're here to help you." But as I moved closer, the figures became clearer, and what I saw defied everything I thought I understood about the situation. The adult figure was definitely male, approximately Vicente's height and build, but something about his posture was wrong. He stood perfectly still, unnaturally rigid, like a scarecrow propped up among the trees. The smaller figure beside him was equally motionless, equally unnatural in its stillness. No 9-year-old boy could stand that still for that long, especially after being lost in the wilderness for days. "Something's not right," Martinez said, joining me as we approached the tree line. "They're not moving. They're not responding to our calls." When we got within 50 yards of the figures, the truth became horrifyingly apparent. What we were looking at weren't Vicente and Diego at all. They were mannequins. Crude but effective representations dressed in clothing that matched the descriptions we'd been given of the missing campers. The adult mannequin wore a red flannel shirt and blue jeans, exactly what Mrs. Gonzalez had told us Vicente was wearing when he left Arizona. The child-sized figure was dressed in a yellow t-shirt and khaki shorts, Diego's last known outfit. But the clothing wasn't new. It was dirty, torn, stained with substances I didn't want to identify. This clothing had been worn by real people probably recently, before being stripped and used to dress these grotesque decoys. "This is sick," Wilson said, his voice filled with disgust and growing anger. "Someone's playing games with us, using those people's clothes to create fake victims." Williams was examining the mannequins more closely when he made another disturbing discovery. "There are speakers," he announced, pointing to small electronic devices hidden in the clothing. That's how they were broadcasting the voices. Someone's been controlling this whole operation remotely. The technical sophistication of what we were seeing was far beyond anything I'd encountered in rural law enforcement. Whoever was behind this had planned extensively, invested significant resources, and demonstrated a level of tactical awareness that suggested military or law enforcement training. "We need to get out of here now," I said. The full implications of our situation finally hitting me. This wasn't a random encounter with lost campers. This was a deliberate setup, and we've been the targets from the beginning. As we turned to leave the mannequins and begin our hike back to civilization, a new sound drifted through the forest. Not the recorded voices we'd been hearing all night, but something far worse. The sound of real human screaming, filled with genuine terror and pain. The screams were coming from deeper in the forest, beyond where we'd searched, beyond where any lost campers should have been able to survive for 4 days without food, water, or medical attention. They were the sounds of people in immediate life-threatening danger. Every instinct I had as a law enforcement officer demanded that we respond to those screams, investigate their source, attempt to help whoever was in distress. But my training and experience told me that responding would be exactly what whoever had orchestrated this situation wanted us to do. The screaming continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving the forest in its familiar, oppressive silence. In that silence, I made the hardest decision of my law enforcement career. "We're leaving," I announced firmly. "Whatever's happening here is bigger than a search and rescue operation. We need backup, proper equipment, and a tactical plan before we go any deeper into this situation." As we began our long hike back toward the logging road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Somewhere in that forest, Vicente and Diego might still be alive, might still be in desperate need of rescue. But leading my team deeper into what was obviously a carefully planned trap wouldn't save anyone. The forest watched us leave in silence, holding its secrets close. But I knew we'd be back, and next time we'd be properly prepared for whatever was waiting in those dark woods. The hunt was far from over. It was just beginning. The 15-mile hike back to the main logging road took us nearly 8 hours, every step of it through terrain that seemed actively hostile to our presence. The dogs remained agitated throughout the journey, constantly looking back toward the forest we were leaving behind, whining softly as if they could sense something following us that we couldn't detect. The path that should have been familiar became increasingly confusing as we walked. Landmarks we'd noted on our way in seemed to have shifted or disappeared entirely. Creek crossings appeared where none should have existed, forcing us to make time-consuming detours through rough terrain. Trail markers that the Forestry Service had installed decades ago were missing, or had been deliberately altered to point in wrong directions. Old Pete, whose knowledge of these mountains should have made him our most reliable guide, was becoming increasingly disturbed by what he was seeing. "This isn't right," he muttered for the dozenth time, studying a trail junction that shouldn't have existed according to our topographical maps. "I've hunted these ridges for 40 years, and this terrain doesn't match what I know." Deputy Torres was having similar problems with his compass and GPS equipment. The compass needle continued to spin wildly, unable to find magnetic north, while his GPS unit displayed error messages or showed our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "It's like someone's jamming our navigation equipment," he reported. "Electronic warfare stuff, military grade, way beyond anything civilian hunters or even criminals should have access to." The implications of sophisticated electronic countermeasures being deployed against our search and rescue operation added another layer of dread to our situation. We weren't dealing with random criminals or survivalist nuts hiding in the wilderness. This was organized, well-funded, and technologically advanced. Around midday, when we stopped to rest and assess our remaining water supplies, Deputy Martinez made an observation that crystallized my growing fears about what we'd encountered. "You know what bothers me most about this whole situation?" he said, taking a careful sip from his water bottle. "The timing." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Think about it," he continued. "Mrs. Gonzalez calls Tuesday morning to report her husband and grandson missing. We organize a search team and get to their campsite by noon the same day. But whoever did this to our camp, whoever set up those mannequins and the recording equipment, that stuff takes time to prepare. Days, maybe weeks." His words sent a chill through me as I realized what he was suggesting. "You think they knew we were coming?" "I think they've been planning this whole operation around us specifically," Martinez replied grimly. "The question is why? What do they want with a bunch of search and rescue volunteers from a small county sheriff's office?" Deputy Wilson, who had been quietly listening to our conversation, offered a theory that made my stomach turn. What if Vicente and Diego were never really missing? What if they were taken specifically to lure search and rescue teams into the area? The possibility that we'd walked into a deliberate trap designed to target law enforcement personnel added a whole new dimension of horror to our situation. If Wilson was right, then everything we'd experienced, the strange evidence, the recorded voices, the destruction of our camp, had been carefully orchestrated to isolate and neutralize our team. As we continued our trek toward civilization, the forest around us began to change in subtle but disturbing ways. The trees seemed to grow larger and more twisted as we walked, their branches reaching toward each other overhead to form an increasingly dense canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. The undergrowth became thicker and more difficult to navigate, forcing us to slow our pace and expend precious energy, pushing through walls of brambles and fallen logs. Most disturbing was the complete absence of wildlife. In healthy forest, even a large group of people should encounter birds, squirrels, deer, and other animals going about their daily routines. Here we saw nothing. No movement, no sounds, no signs that anything lived in these woods except the trees themselves. It's like everything's been scared away, Williams observed, watching his dog's continued nervous behavior. Buster and Sadie are trained to work in all kinds of environments, but they've been on edge since we entered this area yesterday. Whatever's in these woods has got every living thing running scared. As afternoon wore on, our water supplies began to run dangerously low. The creek crossings we encountered were either completely dry or flowing with water that looked and smelled contaminated. Old Pete, whose wilderness survival skills were legendary in our county, refused to let anyone drink from the questionable water sources. Something's wrong with the water, he explained, examining a stream that should have been crystal clear mountain runoff. It's got an oily film on the surface and it smells like chemicals, like someone's been dumping industrial waste upstream. The possibility of environmental contamination added another layer of concern to our situation. If the water sources in the area had been deliberately poisoned, it would explain the absence of wildlife and could pose a serious health threat to anyone stranded in the forest for extended periods. By late afternoon, when we finally reached the main logging road, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and deeply shaken by what we'd experienced. The sight of that dirt road stretching away through normal, healthy-looking forest was more welcome than any of us wanted to admit. Deputy Torres immediately began attempting to raise dispatch on his portable radio, now that we were out of the strange electromagnetic interference that had plagued our communications in the forest. After several tries, he finally made contact with our home station. "Dispatch, this is Torres with Search and Rescue Team Alpha," he said into the radio. "We have an emergency situation. Request immediate backup and tactical support at Deadwater Creek Campground." The response from dispatch was immediate and alarming. "Torres, where the hell have you been?" came the voice of our dispatcher, Mrs. Chen. "We've been trying to reach your team for 2 days. State Police, FBI, and National Guard units have been mobilized for a multi-agency search operation." 2 days. We'd been in the forest for less than 24 hours, but according to dispatch, we'd been missing for 2 full days. The time distortion was impossible but undeniable given the radio timestamp and the level of alarm in Mrs. Chen's voice. "Negative, dispatch," Torres replied, confusion evident in his voice. "We entered the search area yesterday at noon and are returning now, approximately 1800 hours the following day." "Torres, it's Thursday evening," Mrs. Chen's voice crackled through the radio. "You've been missing since Tuesday. Your families are frantic and every law enforcement agency in 3 states is looking for you." The impossible time discrepancy added one final layer of horror to our experience. Somehow we'd lost an entire day in that forest, with no memory of the missing time and no explanation for how such a thing could happen. As we waited for the convoy of backup vehicles that dispatch was sending to our location, I tried to process everything we'd encountered. The strange evidence patterns, the electronic countermeasures, the sophisticated psychological warfare, the missing time. None of it fit the profile of any criminal organization I'd encountered in my law enforcement career. Old Pete summed up what we were all thinking as we sat on the logging road. Watching the sun set over the forest, we'd barely escaped. "Whatever's in those woods," he said quietly, "it ain't human." The convoy of state police, FBI agents, and National Guard vehicles that arrived to extract us from the logging road was the largest law enforcement response our county had ever seen. The fact that 6 law enforcement officers and civilian volunteers had gone missing during a routine search and rescue operation had triggered protocols normally reserved for terrorist attacks or officer-down situations. Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Seattle field office took charge of the scene immediately, establishing a command post and beginning the systematic debriefing that would consume the next 72 hours. Her questions were precise, professional, and increasingly skeptical as our account of events became more difficult to believe. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Agent Chen said, reviewing her notes for the third time. "You're telling me that during your search for 2 missing campers, you encountered sophisticated electronic countermeasures, coordinated psychological warfare, and lost an entire day that you have no memory of?" I knew how it sounded. In the harsh fluorescent lights of the FBI's mobile command unit, surrounded by maps and communications equipment, our experience in the forest seemed impossible even to us. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Vicente's truck had been found exactly where we'd described it, burned down to the metal frame. The mannequins we'd discovered were recovered and sent to the FBI crime lab for analysis. The electronic devices used to broadcast the recorded voices were seized as evidence. Most importantly, the satellite tracking data from our radio equipment showed that we had indeed been in the forest for only 24 hours, despite the fact that we'd been reported missing for 3 days. "The time discrepancy is confirmed," Agent Chen continued, reading from a technical report. "According to GPS data from your radio equipment, your team entered the forest at 12:47 p.m. on Tuesday and emerged at 6:23 p.m. on Wednesday. 29 hours and 36 minutes total. But according to every other record we have, dispatch logs, family statements, search coordination efforts, you were missing from Tuesday afternoon until Thursday evening." The FBI's technical analysis team had found no explanation for the missing time. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual in the forest area during the period in question. Weather records were normal. There were no reports of unusual electromagnetic phenomena or military exercises that could account for what we'd experienced. What troubled Agent Chen most was the complete absence of Vicente and Diego Gonzalez. Despite an intensive search involving hundreds of law enforcement personnel, tracking dogs, helicopters, and ground-penetrating radar, no trace of the missing campers had been found. It was as if they had never existed. "We contacted Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez in Phoenix," Agent Chen informed me during one of our private debriefing sessions. "There's no record of her having a husband named Vicente or a grandson named Diego. No one by those names lives at the address she gave you. The phone number she called from is registered to a prepaid cellular service that was purchased with cash and can't be traced." The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. The missing persons case that had started our entire ordeal had been fabricated. Someone had deliberately lured our search and rescue team into that forest using false information about people who didn't exist. "But we found their campsite," I protested. "Their truck, their equipment, evidence of their presence." "The truck was stolen from a Phoenix airport parking lot 3 weeks ago," Agent Chen replied. "The camping equipment was purchased with cash from sporting goods stores throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Someone went to considerable expense and effort to create the appearance of missing campers." The FBI's investigation eventually expanded to include specialists in domestic terrorism, organized crime, and what Agent Chen euphemistically referred to as unusual phenomena. None of their experts could provide a satisfactory explanation for what our team had experienced. The mannequins dressed in Vicente and Diego's clothing remained the most disturbing piece of physical evidence. Laboratory analysis revealed that the clothing had indeed been worn by real people. DNA evidence confirmed the presence of biological material from 2 individuals, 1 adult male and 1 juvenile male. But there were no matches in any database, and the chemical composition of some of the stains suggested exposure to substances that didn't exist in any known industrial or military inventory. The speakers hidden in the mannequins were broadcasting equipment that's at least 20 years ahead of anything currently available to civilian or military organizations, Agent Chen explained. The power source was some kind of microreactor that our nuclear specialists have never seen before.
The electronic countermeasures that disabled your navigation equipment required technology that's theoretically possible, but not practically achievable, with current engineering. As the weeks passed,
The FBI's investigation gradually wound down without reaching any conclusions. Agent Chen was reassigned to other cases. The physical evidence was archived in federal storage facilities. The official report classified our experience as unexplained phenomena requiring no further investigation at this time. But for those of us who had been in that forest, the case never ended. Deputy Martinez transferred to a different county within 6 months, unable to sleep through the night without dreaming about wolf whistles in the darkness. Deputy Wilson left law enforcement entirely, moving to Florida where he now works as a fishing guide and refuses to discuss what happened in the mountains. Old Pete died the following winter, officially of a heart attack, but his family claimed he'd been acting strangely since our return from the forest, often talking about sounds in the woods that no one else could hear. Williams and his tracking dogs were never quite the same either. Buster and Sadie, once considered the best search and rescue team in the state, became increasingly unreliable after our experience. They would refuse to enter certain areas of wilderness, cowering and whining when asked to work in dense forest conditions, similar to what we'd encountered at Deadwater Creek. As for me, I remained with the Sheriff's Department for another 5 years, but never participated in another search and rescue operation. Every time a missing persons call came in involving wilderness areas, I would remember the sound of Diego's recorded voice calling for help in the darkness, and I would find excuses to send other deputies instead. I've spent 35 years since that August in 1987 trying to understand what happened to us in those mountains. I've read every book on unexplained phenomena, corresponded with researchers who study similar cases, and interviewed dozens of other law enforcement officers who've encountered situations that defy conventional explanation. What I've learned is that we weren't the first search and rescue team to disappear into the Northwest wilderness and return with impossible stories. There have been dozens of similar cases over the decades, all involving the same basic pattern. Missing persons reports that turn out to be fabricated, search teams that encounter sophisticated countermeasures and psychological warfare, physical evidence that suggests technology beyond current human capabilities. The files on these cases are scattered across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, often classified or buried in bureaucratic archives where they'll never be reviewed by anyone with the authority to connect the patterns. But the patterns are there for anyone willing to look. My nephew, who asked me to tell this story, is now a deputy himself in a different state. He's never had to respond to a search and rescue call in dense wilderness, and I pray to God he never will. Because somewhere in those dark forests, something is still hunting, still setting traps, still collecting law enforcement personnel for purposes I don't want to imagine. Mrs. Gonzalez, whoever she really was, made one phone call that destroyed the lives of everyone on our search team. Vicente and Diego, whether they were real people or elaborate fictions, served their purpose as bait to lure us into that forest. And somewhere in those mountains, in forests that look normal and peaceful on satellite images and topographical maps, the hunt continues, waiting for the next search and rescue team brave enough or foolish enough to answer the call for help. I retired from law enforcement in 1992, exactly 5 years after our encounter at Deadwater Creek. I moved to a small town in the desert Southwest, as far from dense forests as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I've never been camping since that August in 1987, and I never will again. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is still and the desert is silent, I hear them, faint and distant, carried on air currents that shouldn't exist. The sounds of wolf whistles and a young boy's voice calling for help. They're still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next team of rescuers to answer their call. The case file on the Deadwater Creek incident remains open in the FBI's archives, stamped with classifications that ensure it will never be fully investigated or publicly disclosed. Agent Chen, who supervised the initial investigation, died in a car accident 2 years later, under circumstances that her family still questions. And in the mountains of the Northwest, the forests grow darker and more impenetrable with each passing year, holding their secrets close while they wait for new prey to stumble into their trap. The hunt that began in August 1987 never ended. It just moved to different forests, different states, different search and rescue teams whose members are now experiencing the same impossible encounters that destroyed our lives. If you're reading this account and you work in search and rescue, Wilderness law enforcement, or any related field, please remember our story. Question missing persons reports that seem too convenient, too perfectly designed to draw you into remote wilderness areas. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about a search location. And never ever go into the deep forests alone, because somewhere in those dark woods something is still hunting, and it's very, very patient. This account was compiled from interviews with the surviving members of Search and Rescue Team Alpha, FBI case files obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, and personal documents provided by the families of the deceased team members. The names of some individuals have been changed to protect their privacy and ensure their continued safety. The Deadwater Creek incident remains an open case in federal law enforcement databases. Anyone with information regarding similar encounters is encouraged to contact the FBI's Unusual Phenomena Investigation Unit through official channels. The wilderness areas mentioned in this account remain accessible to the public, though local authorities strongly recommend that civilian hikers and campers travel in large groups and maintain regular contact with park ranger stations when venturing into remote forest locations.